What's up guys, MTG Tournament Grinder here, and welcome to this week's episode of Modern. This time around we've got Hardened Scales versus Blue-Black Fairies. So let's go ahead and take a look at my opening 7, see if it's any good. And actually, you know what, Forest plus Hardened Scales, followed by Arcbound Worker and Hangerback Walker is actually kind of super good. So as for my opponent, Ghost Quarter, Polluted Delta, with some hand disruption, lots of removal, Spell Stutter Sprite. She could be used to counter something like an Ancient Stirrings, perhaps. And, of course, I don't know her hand on the day of recording, but turn 1 fetch, shock. That can only mean one of very few things. So don't think I'm very surprised when I see what happens next. Yeah, the Inquisition of Kozilek. And she gets to see my whole hand. 3 lands and 4 good spells. And they are all good, but I think the pick here is kind of obvious. The namesake card of the deck. And as if I recall, yeah, she indeed does make the correct choice. My hand is still good, but it's not nearly as powerful as it was when I had that Hardened Scales. Even having drawn the Steel Overseer, which is a good draw. I need to keep making good draws if I'm going to outlast all this counter magic and removal. And I'm unaware that my opponent drew a Remand just now. So I'm pretty sure in my head, I'm thinking, I don't want to play the Steel Overseer, not into spot removal. I would rather play Hangerback Walker into spot removal, and at least get that token. Little did I know that my opponent is actually playing more counter magic than I was aware. Yep. I mean, at least it goes back to my hand. I get to try again later, but that feels pretty bad. Remand is a great card. Yikes. Now she's trying to cast down another removal spell. So, judging by the texture of our hands, I'd say I've got my work cut out for me. And that actually Evolutionary Leap could be quite good. Because she has 3 removal spells in hand. So if I can just activate Evolutionary Leap in response to each of those, I might be okay. Yikes though, Spell Stutter Sprite, my Ancient Stirrings. I mean, with 3 mana, it's like I can Ancient Stirrings, find something, and still play a 2-drop. So I think in most situations there, first things first, do Ancient Stirrings, you know. Then starting with Ancient Stirrings was the right line. But Spell Stutter Sprite was just the perfect creature at the perfect time. And this is how Fairies gets value, kind of. It always feels like it's very precarious. It's right on the verge of falling apart. But if they make the right targets with their hand disruption spells, and then cast all the removal on all the right targets at all the right times, you know, that Fairies can stay on top of you. But it requires the correct choice at so many junctions. Not unlike Hardened Scales, actually. Hardened Scales has a lot of different triggers that come up, and there's a lot of different routes that you can pursue. Like this one here, Fatal pushing my my Hangerback Walker before I have the chance to make it any larger. I think that's the right play. Although now I do have a Thopter that I can block her Spell Stutter Sprite with. Top deck Mox Opal. It's not very exciting. Although it is a 2nd green source. Horizon Canopy is a 3rd green source, but I don't think I'll be using it. So at this point, I can both play Evolutionary Leap and Steel Overseer with my 4 mana. Yeah, and then I'm holding up green through the Mox Opal, so I could even activate the Evolutionary Leap. Interesting that I played the Steel Overseer first. Perhaps I actually value Evolutionary Leap more, knowing she has so much spot removal. Yeah, and sure enough, Evolutionary Leap on the stack before I can get value, go ahead and kill my good card. Makes sense. So playing Steel Overseer first was wrong. Definitely not correct. In retrospect. I mean, Magic is like that. You can make the right decision at the time with the information that you had, only to find out later that it was in fact the wrong decision. And it's like, can you beat yourself up for that? It's like, I made the right decision. It's just, you know, wasn't the it wasn't actually the right decision. Wasn't the correct right decision, as it were. Sounds ridiculous. These are the things I think about that keep me up at night. In Murderous Cut, the worker, yeah, response, I used that green that I held up through the Mox. Modular, target the Thopter. Now I've got a good blocker for the Spellstutter Sprite. Ah, nice. And Ballista is a great card in this matchup. Let's see, it could definitely shoot down the Spellstutter Sprite in this particular instance. Vendilion Click is a 3/1. Can shoot down all the Bitter Blossom tokens. I can see the Bitter Blossom in my opponent's hand. The Mistbind Click, however, is like a 4/4 or a 4/3 or something. That's one of the few that I can't just snipe down. That is not without a Basilisk Collar. Okay, so top deck, Arcbound Worker, play the Worker. Animation Module would be nice. Yep. Ballista for 1, and I'm holding up green. I would use the Mox first if I had to. And then if it was like double removal spell or something, I would use the Horizon Canopy and take myself to 16. But oof, yeah, Dismember. Yeah, I would rather like have a Walking Ballista on 1 and have the flexibility of Evolutionary Leap than play the Walking Ballista for 2. Like if I had completely tapped out for the Walking Ballista, this Dismember would feel a lot worse than it actually did. I mean, I don't know. I ended up just shooting the Spellstutter Sprite. I'm not sure if that was even correct. It may have been better just to sacrifice it and get a new card in hand. I mean, that's another thing you can do if you hold up Mox and Horizon Canopy. Just go ahead and sack it at the end step if you're not forced to do anything. And I drew the animation module that I was asking for. Now that I've done all my counter stuff, but that's okay. Starting next turn, I'll have enough mana to activate the bottom part of animation module, which will trigger the top part. Start making some servos, aka crew members. I feel like I should address. You might notice the animation module looks slightly different than ones you might know. I really enjoy Star Trek, so I themed animation module to make crew members, and then Hangerback Walker to make Thopters, or I'm sorry, starships and Star Trek lingo. So I had a really fun time designing these tokens, and little altars for the 2 cards that make the tokens. Mistbind Click though, back to the game at hand. Tapping down all my lands. In response, I'll go ahead and activate animation module and pay for it. Do what I was talking about. And hopefully Commander Data will leave us all like he does. Top deck Hardened Scales. I'm such a nerd, guys. I'm sorry about that. And I figure better late than never, but I'm all tapped out. I did my thing already. Interesting. So that's not a bad line. I couldn't swing with my 3/3 flyer, so I'll just poke with my 1/1. Either it gets in and it speeds up this clock that Bitter Blossom has already started, or my opponent will block, modular trigger. Now I have a 4/4. It's like now I can handle the big threat. Forest is not good, but it's a green source. So now I can play the Hardened Scales and have the same amount of Evolutionary Leap activations. And at this point, it's looking pretty positive. Yeah, I think swing out is the line. Have to block the 4/4, and you're not just gonna chump it. You're gonna trade. So yeah, that all makes sense. Before damage. Yeah, animation module is such a good card. It really, really is. Like, I almost wish that they would call this version of affinity like animation module affinity instead of hardened scales affinity. Yeah, and that wraps up game 1. Well, I think right at the end there, my opponent started to draw quite a bit of lands, and the value I can get out of one card, like animation module, can consume 3 or 4 cards out of my opponent's hand. So let's go ahead and take a look at some sideboarding, and meet you guys back here in game 2. Alrighty, as for my opponent's sideboarding plans, they brought in 1 copy of Echoing Truth, which is an instant for 1 in a blue, return target non-land permanent and all other permanents with the same name as that permanent to their owner's hands. So Echoing Truths is particularly good against tokens. You just name Servo and bounce all my Servos, or Thopter and bounce all my Thopters, but when you bounce tokens, of course, they don't come back. So that's quite good against the token strategy, which is unfortunate because the token strategy is really good against decks with lots of removal, in decks like Fairies, one might say. So looking back on it, actually, it's completely possible that I might keep like an animation module or a Hangerback Walker hand game 2 on purpose, trying to outlast the removal that I think is coming, and unknowingly play right into the hands of an Echoing Truth that's just waiting for me. So that would be unfortunate if that went down in that way, but only because Echoing Truth is so damn good. My opponent also brought in 1 copy of Pithing Needle. That's a 1-drop artifact. Choose a card name. Activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. So this is a really flexible card. I'm sure Fairies or any deck that plays it can bring it in against quite a few decks. But of course, in this matchup, being brought in against Hardened Scales, if you're naming things in the blind, I think Arcbound Ravager is generally a safe bet. That pretty much takes away my ability to win the game all at once, like for example with an Inkmoth Nexus Infect kill, or making a giant Ballista shoot you for 18, or something like that. Actually, also naming Ballista would be a really good value for a Fairies player, because Ballista can mostly just snipe just about every creature in their deck. Vendilion Click is a 3/1, Spellstutter Sprite is a 1/1, Scion of Una, although it is a Lord, itself it is a 1/1. I think really Mutavault being a 2/2, and the Mistbind Click, it's either a 4/4 or like a 4/3 or something. Those are just about the only ones that I can't snipe down with just 1 shot. So naming Walking Ballista I think could be quite good. I think either of those cards are great to name if you're just pulling cards out of a hat and trying to like do damage control and preventative maintenance by naming a card out of the blue. But that's only one way of using Pithing Needle. Another way, perhaps a better way, arguably, is to wait until your opponent plays the threat that you need to name. And now that they've played a particular threat, like once I have played an Arcbound Ravager, now play Pithing Needle, name Arcbound Ravager. The problem, depending on the threat, is that I'll have a chance to respond with that threat and move counters around if it happened to be Ravager. I have time for me to do whatever I can do as far as damage control. Also, my opponent brought in 1 copy of Ratchet Bomb. Ratchet Bomb says, tap, put a charge counter on Ratchet Bomb, and then tap, sacrifice Ratchet Bomb, destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Ratchet Bomb. So this card's flexibility is why it is so good against Hardened Scales. If I am playing the token strategy, blow it up on 0, kill all my tokens. If I have 1 or more Hardened Scales and like maybe a few Arcbound Workers, obviously you want to blow it up on 1. If my game plan is revolving around an Arcbound Ravager, moving around a bunch of counters that were given out by Steel Overseer, blow it up on 2. And granted, a typical game from Hardened Scales isn't usually divided so cleanly into the 0, 1, or 2 CMC game plan, as it were, but the pressure that Ratchet Bomb applies when you don't know its controller's intentions is, in a way, then worse than when their intentions are obvious. I guess what I mean by that, if you are playing a really transparent game plan in the sense that all your good cards are 2-drops, and you know they're going to put it on 2. That is a known factor, and a known factor is like a stable, controlled factor. If you have Hardened Scales and an animation module on 1, and then also several good 2-drops, and you've made a bunch of servos already, or something like that. I'm trying to imagine a situation where your board is well dispersed between the CMC slots. That wildcard factor of not knowing when they're going to stop ticking it up and when they're going to sacrifice it and actually use it. I think that kind of wildcard pressure is more intense than the stable, I know what you're going to do pressure. My opponent also brought in 1 copy of Engineered Explosives, another artifact, this one with X as its mana cost, Sunburst. This enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it for each color of mana spent to cast it. So on blue-black fairies, you could either cast it for 0, 1, or 2. Pay 2 mana, sacrifice Engineered Explosives, destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Engineered Explosives. So this may sound slightly familiar, it's a lot like Ratchet Bomb, and I feel like because it's so similar to Ratchet Bomb, it's actually good in this matchup for similar reasons, although it lacks that unknown wildcard factor that I was talking about that Ratchet Bomb has. Ratchet Bomb on 1 could still mean a Ratchet Bomb on 2, whereas an Engineered Explosives on 1 is rather unambiguously an Engineered Explosives on 1. That's not going to change. The advantage of EE is that you can play it on 2 immediately and sacrifice it right away, whereas to get value out of a Ratchet Bomb on the same CMC slot, 2, it has to be on the battlefield for at least 2 turns. And the last card my opponent brought in was Death Shadow. Actually, believe it or not, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. It costs 1 black for 13/13, and it says Death Shadow gets -X/-X, where X is your life total. So this is a spicy sideboard plan. I like it a lot. Faeries already runs like a fetch shock mana base, and with Bitter Blossom in the deck, I think it can arguably hurt itself enough to support running a Death Shadow out of the sideboard. And besides adding a decent threat, like, the actual point of the card, I think really it's the surprise factor that will catch people off guard and give you quite a bit of advantage. So really cool idea. I know I had a lot to say about my opponent's sideboarding plan. This time around I actually typed out my notes instead of writing them by hand. And guess what? I ended up with a lot more notes because I typed them. But don't worry, my own sideboarding plans are a lot more brief. I only brought in 2 copies of Karn, Scion of Urza. I'm sure you all know what this card does, but it's a 4 mana planeswalker, colorless. It has a +1 that says reveal the top 2 cards of your library. An opponent chooses one of them, put that card into your hand, and exile the other with a silver counter on it. Its next ability is a -1, put a card you own with a silver counter on it from exile into your hand. So the +1 and the -1 interact with each other in a really cool way that gives you lots of card advantage. And last but not least, it's -2. Create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. So generally, I'll bring in Karn for the long and grindy matchups, as well as against decks with lots of removal. And I think Faeries, depending on the texture of our hands, it can be both of those things, both grindy, and it definitely has lots of removal. Now, the reason Karn is good in those situations is that a Karn, which is 1 card, can produce multiple threats. He can do this either with his -2 by just making straight up constructs that are in and of themselves threats, or by using a combination of his +1 and -1 to find me other threats straight out of my deck. Like I could use it to find an Archbound Ravager, or getting an Ancient Stirrings into my hand using Karn is like nothing but net. So anytime 1 card can produce multiple threats, which your opponent has to use multiple cards to deal with, you're coming out ahead. And this makes him great against like Fatal Push, Thoughtseize decks, where you can start to get back some of that card advantage you lost on turn 1 and 2. And wrapping things up, the last card I brought in was 2 copies of Heroic Intervention. This is an instant for 1 and a green. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So same as Karn, Heroic Intervention comes in for this matchup because of the amount of removal in Faeries. So it's good against removal heavy decks. Saving a creature from targeted removal, or not, could mean the difference between winning and losing, and in fact has for me many times. But I digress. Those are the cards that me and my opponent both brought in. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump back into Game 2. Alrighty, and we are back with Game 2. Me and my opponent are both armed to the teeth with sideboard cards. I'm pretty excited about the possibility of drawing a Heroic Intervention or a Karn. I'm really fond of both of those cards. Yikes, and I guess sometimes you better be careful because you get what you ask for. There's that Heroic Intervention in a terrible one-lander that's not even close enough to turning on Mox. No green source to get started with my Ancient Stirrings. I think no. Yeah, this is a nope. Going to 6. As for my opponent, looks like 4 lands. She will not be missing her land drops. Counterspell in the form of Remand, Bontu's Last Reckoning, pretty sweet board wipe, and Pithing Needle. Yeah, I don't think you mulligan a hand that has more than one sideboard card. Plus counter magic. So my opponent keeps her 7. I'm looking at my 6 now. Oh, please. Thank God. Okay, at least there's 1 land. Several 1-drops. The animation module makes them better. Scrying a Darksteel Citadel to the top feels pretty good. It's not like the best thing in the world, but it's a land. Which, as far as my scries could go, kind of is the best thing in the world. So, leading off with the animation module, no doubt. Next turn, land, Arcbound Worker, and pay for the animation module trigger, make a servo. Clean cut plan. Now, hopefully my opponent doesn't do anything to interrupt my plan. I know that she has that Pithing Needle that we saw in her opener. And she got to see at the end of game 1 just how good animation module could be. So, yep. Pithing Needle naming animation module. And here we call the judge, actually. You might see him pick up the card in a few minutes. We're wondering if the top part of animation module is either a triggered ability or a activated ability. Of course, Pithing Needle says activated abilities can't be activated, so it matters quite a lot. And we were told that the bottom part, where there is a semicolon, pay 3 mana, tap, do a thing, that is an activated ability. The top part that says whenever, ... that part is a triggered ability. So fortunately, my plans still get to go through. Arcbound Worker, trigger, pay for a servo, and hopefully Captain Picard will help us through. Game 2. So holding up 3 mana, only 1 either blue or black source. Hardened Scales, not a bad top deck. Better now than much later. Of course, it would have been ideal to play. Of course, it would have been ideal to play on turn 1, but I didn't even have a green source in my opening hand. Nice. Commander Data to back us up, and swing for 2. And I'm starting to see a trend on my opponent's side. I think she drew a land last time as well. So I know I hate it when I draw nothing but lands. And actually I can sympathize with my opponents as well, but darn. You know what? Forget sympathy. Bontu's Last Reckoning? Ah, hell no. Oh man, that's really good. No targets for my modular. Captain Picard is not going to help us out anymore. Hopefully I draw something with counters. Ruins of Warren Reef will help whenever I do draw something with counters, but for now it certainly doesn't help very much. Yeah, I mean, go ahead and play all my non-creature spells that will aid any and everything that I draw from here on out. Although it's pretty important that I get started with a counter from somewhere. Very hard choice. Just get started with the counters in the form of a Walking Ballista. Yeah, I think I'll try that. No, Mana Leak. Well, my other alternative was to play a Karn. And since my opponent hasn't actually resolved any threats that make the Walking Ballista like essential right this second, I think I would rather have had it gone the way it did, actually. I think losing the Walking Ballista but keeping the Karn is better. I mean, I shouldn't count my chickens before they hatch. I haven't resolved Karn yet, but if Walking Ballista has paid for the sins of Karn and allows Karn to rise, then I think I'll be okay with that trade. Nice. Okay, well, I'm starting to do my counters thing. Arcbound Worker comes in with 2 instead of 1. Make a servo off the trigger and then put counters on the servo. Nice. I like that play. And then for the final time, pay for the last trigger on animation module. So I spent 4 mana. I mean, I tapped 4 lands, but I ended up with a 2/2, a 3/3, and a 1/1. For 4 mana. So that's really not that bad. Yikes, so my opponent is continuing to draw lands. I mean, at the time, when you're playing a game of Magic and you don't know what your opponent is top decking, and of course you want to win because you're in the shop and there's prizes and you can get some packs at the end of the night, it's easy to get caught up in the act of winning. But looking back on it now, I've been watching my opponent draw land after land. It's rough, man. That's rough. I know it feels bad, but it happens to me. So I drew a second copy of Hardened Scales. That's pretty interesting. I mean, it won't help me now. I'm not going to be distributing any counters. I guess I could play Hardened Scales, activate animation module, and then not be able to take advantage of making the servo. So I'm looking at her graveyard. I think that was looking at the potential for counter spells. I've already seen 1 Remand and 1 Mana Leak. So I'm just hoping that Karn... No. I mean, that's why I was looking at her graveyard, trying to ascertain the odds of whether or not I thought it would resolve. I mean, I did bring in 2 Karns, so if I see another one, that's 1 less counter squall that I have to be worried about for later. And yeah, this kind of slow, grindy game of ours will continue. Yikes, though, more islands. I mean, I'm by no means like winning this race in a dramatic fashion. I suppose I have the cards on board to be able to do that, but it certainly hasn't started yet. I mean, honestly, I'm over here like lamenting for my opponent drawing so many lands, but she only has 1 more than I do. It's been kind of bad draws for both of us. I just have this engine on board of the Hardened Scales, the animation module, and at least 1 starting counter to get started with. And this is one of the many situations in which Basilisk Collar really helps. It's not like it's only good against burn, or it's only good if I get to put it on a ballista and shoot Tarmogoyfs with it. I mean, of course, both of those situations are ideal, but even just putting it on a worker and gaining 2 every time I deal 2, that's slowly putting me further and further ahead. And if we both continue to draw lands, my opponent and I, yeah, see, I didn't draw anything. If my opponent keeps drawing lands, I've got a clock. I have a significant enough of a board presence, I think, to power through this stall that's happening to us both. And I just have to say it again, Basilisk Collar is what is making the situation so incredibly good. If it was like, I swing for 3 and then she swings for 2, then I swing for 3 and she swings for 2, it's like that would still ultimately end up in my favor if nothing changed. But me swinging for 3 and then her essentially swinging for 0 because I keep gaining the 2 that she's inflicting, that is like I'm not going to lose kind of situation. But I talked right over Karn. I did draw my second, and this time there was no counter spell. So out of fear of like, I'm not sure what, some spell that will kill Karn, I went ahead and made the construct that'll help me close out this game. I think that's probably more important than gambling with his +1. I mean, card advantage is good, but it's not as sure of a thing as a like 5/5 construct. 6/6 if I activate my Inkmoth Nexus. 7/7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Activate Inkmoth Nexus 7. Yep. Although it looks like I may have miscounted. It's hard to tell. I'm not listening to audio. But I believe my opponent... okay, it doesn't matter anyways. Go ahead and chump the construct. Take 5. And at this point it seems awfully one-sided, I have to admit. Okay, yeah, there's the handshake. Well, my goodness, what a great match. Echoing Truth is in hand. I think she was telling me if they were both servos or if they were both constructs, then maybe. No. I mean, that's rough, drawing lots of lands like that, but at the same time, that's magic for you. And it kind of happened to us both. But I really enjoyed this matchup. I think Faeries is a ton of fun to play against. And actually, I'm looking for a new deck to play. I'm considering Faeries. If you guys have any suggestions as to decks that you'd like to see me play on the channel, please let me know in the comments below. Also, don't forget to go head over to Twitch and check me out on there. I stream what will now be Mondays and Fridays at around 7 p.m. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoy content like this, you can let me know in the comments below or by hitting that subscribe button. So, until next week, I'll see you guys later.